Now, I said a minute ago, you're basically an American. You were brought up in America. How is it for an American to spend 26 years in Europe? I mean, do you lose contact with your country? Do you become more European? Do you see things differently?
One sees things differently, certainly. I keep contact naturally with my family and my friends. I make a great effort to. My friends are very important to me, and I go often to the United States, and I'm very eager to, to keep up with what goes on there. And I think it's fairly easy for most Europeans to do. I don't think Americans keep up with what's happening in Europe very much. When I'm in America, it's very hard to find any news about what's happening in Europe. But of course, once my children were born here, I began to feel at home, and this is where my family is now. And so in many ways I feel European, but certainly my education is American, and I'm still very much American.
What do you see as the basic differences between the way Europeans see things and Americans see things? Do you see a difference?
Well, of course, yes, there is a difference, but it would be hard to describe, I think, because the world is changing so much and so rapidly, and what would have been true of a European way of thinking 10 or 20 years ago certainly isn't true today. I don't know. It would depend on which subject and which.
Well, as a way of life, the European way of life is different than the American way of life.
Well, that's different in Northern Europe than in Southern Europe. We perhaps have more in common here with other Mediterranean countries than we would with some of the Northern European countries. And the Mediterranean countries seem to hold on to older traditions longer, and don't accept change very easily.
Don't you think also that there are different views of the values of, for example, time and...
oh, certainly.
And the relationship with nature and...
Well, I think people here, particularly in Monaco and on the coast here, live each day as it comes a little bit more, and are not quite in such a hurry and such a rush.
Was it difficult for you to, I mean, you'd had a very public life in America in the motion picture industry. Of course, you've had a public life here, but it's a totally different life.
Very different. When I was acting, of course, I loved acting. I loved working in the theater and pictures. I didn't particularly like being a movie star, if you know what I mean. There's a big difference. I loved working at my craft. I didn't like having to have a public, the public appearance of being a movie star. Although even in Hollywood, my private life was pretty much my own. When I married, my private life became public, and I really had no privacy at all, and that was an adjustment to make.
Have you resented the invasion of your private life? Do you feel the press has been unfair about it?
Well, in certain instances, yes, definitely. Although, as far as my husband and I are concerned, we are public figures, and we have to expect that. Where my children are concerned, they resent it very much, and they don't feel they are public figures and that they don't have to be at their age. And particularly their growing up years have been made very, very difficult because of the press and the so-called paparazzi who follow them relentlessly. And it's not always their fault. They're just trying to make a living the best way they can. But it's the editors who encourage them to do this and buy the pictures. And this has been very, very difficult and has caused a great deal of anguish to me and to my children. And they make up things. They've made up romances. They love to say my children have flunked out of school when they haven't. In fact, they've all been very good students. They love to say, well, if you believe some of the things, I would have had at least 52 babies by now. For many years, I was always expecting a baby, according to the press, or that my husband and I are constantly being divorced, which also is not the case. But my children have had to. Stephanie, for 2 years, went to gymnastic class in the trunk of the automobile, just so that they wouldn't follow her, wouldn't see her. And then, and you know, there've been instances where Carolyn used to come home in tears from a tennis lesson. She said, well, I couldn't have the lesson because the photographers were there and I didn't want to take it with them, taking pictures, you know, and it was just this continual, and they have felt, particularly Carolyn has felt very much, I suppose, like a hunted animal, you know, with the hounds after her, and it's, you know, they really go in for the kill sometimes, and it's unfortunate. You know, I've always felt that I'm always willing to give the other fellow the benefit of the doubt, and I certainly respect people who have a job to do, but when it comes to some papers kind of feel that we're fictitious characters and that gives them the right to make up any kind of story they want. And this is, you know, one is helpless in defense of that. And if a child is very young, I find it very, well, outrageous, really, that when Stephanie was 16, they've had her engaged to someone she never even set eyes on. Not engaged, but I mean, saying sneaking out to sea, or being, you know, putting innuendos there that made it sound something very disagreeable. And that's been hard for them. Growing up in the spotlight is not easy, and it's been tough. I'll throw it to you. I don't think any mother can really see the future. I think with all my children, I hope that they'll be able to bring out their qualities as individuals.
You've been talking about the children, which leads me to another question, and that is, you were brought up in America. You were brought up in Philadelphia in an Irish Catholic family, and now you brought up 3 children in a totally different atmosphere here in Europe. What would you say, first of all, are the basic differences between the way you yourself were brought up and the way you brought up your own children?
Well, I think I've tried to instill a lot of my own upbringing into to their life, because we only know from our own experience, and I've tried to adapt what I thought would be useful to them. I think I've tried to expose them to as many things as possible, to teach them as many skills as possible, to expose them to as many points of view as possible. We've often had them with us, with our friends, you know, they haven't been, I find that with a lot of my American friends, the children are sort of pushed off to be with the children. We've always tried to include the children with us and our friends and have all ages together, which I think is more beneficial and more fun for everyone. Maybe our children don't always think it that way, but I think on the whole they're very fond of our friends, and they've learned a lot from being around older people. Also here in Monte Carlo, we have at certain times of year, it's a very international meeting point. And we've had perhaps around our table as many nationalities as guests often. And so our children have been exposed to a lot. Naturally, being in Europe, the emphasis on languages is more important. Our children all speak English and French perfectly. 2 of them speak German, 2 Spanish, and 2 of them Italian. So that, you know, this, I think, is an important part of their culture. Also, what can I say, the difference? Well, there have been so many differences in American education since I was educated there, too. I mean, so it's hard to compare. The changes in American schools from what it was 20 years ago as now is very different. And even here in Europe, I noticed there's a big difference from the time that Caroline was in school as to her sister Stephanie, and there's 8 years difference. So, you know, as mothers and educators, we have to adapt and change all the time.
Well, I mean, I have a son, 16, so he's about the age of Stephanie,
yeah.
just about to do his baccalaureate, and I must say that when he gets together with his American friends or goes to America, they seem to have no meeting point. the European education has provided a much richer cultural, linguistic, and so on background than American. Do you find that true?
Perhaps intellectually they're more advanced, but they're less self-reliant, I think. American kids are taught to be more self-reliant and more on their own earlier, and given perhaps a little more responsibility. Of course, I rather deplore the lack of discipline everywhere today. We sort of tend to think that knowledge is a substitute for discipline, and it never will be. Our children were brought up with a certain amount of discipline and found it quite natural. I think our son, when he went to college in the States, had suffered kind of a cultural shock because he wasn't prepared for the sort of imposed liberties that one finds on an American campus. But he has been to America very often. He spent many summers there, and of course they have cousins the same age, and they've visited back and forth. So, you know, they have contacts with America and feel very much at ease there.
Did you and Prince Rainier kind of divide up the responsibilities and did you have any definite plan in dividing the responsibilities and bringing up the children?
Well, we discuss things all the time, and I think most of the discipline falls to the mother, but the threat of a father's no carries a lot of weight. And then I think when children are in their teenage years, the presence of father is very important and very necessary.
Was your father a disciplinarian?
Not too much. I'm afraid my mother had
that job.
Had the job. It has fallen to me quite a bit as well.
And so you've inherited that job from your mother. One of the basic differences between when you grew up and your children growing up today is the impact of television on young people's lives. I mean, you barely had any television in your life. Is that true?
Well, of course, television has invaded the household, hasn't it? I mean, it seems to have replaced everything in our lives today. But of course, when I was growing up, we did have a bit of television because my father was very friendly with some had friends at Philco, and they were just making their first experiments, and they would put place sets in various families here and there, and they had programs 3 times a week, I remember, and they would send us an announcement of the programs for the next week, and we would have to check out what the reception, how the reception was, the quality of the program, this, which my brother, sisters, and I did very religiously. We thought that was a great responsibility and great fun. So we were aware of television quite early. And then, of course, I worked in television as an actress. I worked in live television in the early 50s. And that was quite a challenge and very exciting. It was sort of the pioneer days of television, and it really was wonderful to be part of it.
And how's television different now? I mean, you said it invaded the home.
Well, you know, when you have there's a film to see or a book to read, it's a matter of choice. You choose to go to see that film, you buy that book. The television programming is just pushed into your house, and there it is. And I know the people in charge, well, it's up to the families to choose what their children should see. I have tried, when the children were in school, saying, well, you don't watch television as long as you have homework, and during the week we won't watch television. Well, then, of course, father comes home and he turns on the set, and the children think, what are you going to do? And there's no way of keeping children from watching television. And I found it very, very difficult. I tried to use it as a means of punishment. If marks are bad, no television. But of course, it's a wonderful means of education, but it also has its bad points. It can be very destructive. And I know a teacher here in Monaco who has said to me, oh, I dread Monday recreation because these kids are acting out everything they've seen on television. And it's pretty rough and violent. So, you know, it is one of the problems of our time, but I always think that because something is possible doesn't mean it's always desirable. And we're going through that excuse me, this
No.
sort of experience now with television, because it's possible, it should be on all the time and everyone should be watching everything. And it's become a babysitter. So for children, it can be very dangerous, and then children become brain-soaked by it and numbed. And I've read some statistics not too long ago saying that an American child, on reaching the age 18, has seen 18,000 murders and 350,000 commercials. Now that's kind of scary, isn't it? But on the other hand, television has been a great companion to people alone, to people in hospitals, people in remote areas. It's been wonderful. But
do you have any precise examples of influences or bad influences it may have had on your own children at some point? Something that happened?
Yes, I remember Caroline watching television as a child and being quite upset and quite hysterical over seeing something, and it was all I could do to try to tell her that it was make-believe. But television goes from newsreels or actualities into fiction, into movies. How does a small child know the difference? How do they know what's really happening and what isn't happening?
Maybe that's because real life is like that today. As we look around the world, it's hard to tell the difference between reality and fiction. Don't you think that is? I mean, it's tougher and tougher, for example, for novelists to write novels that have some new factor in them, because what's going on in the news often it overpowers them.
Well, that's true. Definitely.
Do you think, one of the problems obviously is to what extent does the family have a responsibility, the parents have a responsibility to monitor what their children watch on television?
Well, I think as far as possible they certainly should, and it's a parent's duty to do that, but there are more and more mothers who are working, and there are families who have more than one television set. So it's very difficult, and if parents are out, how do you know what your child's watching? You can't tell. And they're different, particularly in America, they're different time zones. What might be on late in the East is on early enough in the West for children to see. They haven't gone to bed yet. I know the movies that I've forbidden my children to see in a theater, but then they're shown on television. You know, so.
Let me go back to, you said something interesting about bilingualism. I think it's true that in Europe, many, many more people are bilingual than they are in the United States. Some people find it difficult to teach a child two languages at the same time. Did you have a particular method in doing that?
It's very difficult, and there are dangers to it. I received a letter from a teacher when Caroline was first born, and she gave me some very good advice. And she said a child can learn any number of languages as long as they associate a language with a person. And if one person tries to teach two languages to a child, it's lost. It's very bad. They confuse them. A child can have a problem with stuttering. And then, of course, I found that the dangers with bringing children up in two languages is that one often has there's the danger of having of missing things in both languages, you know, so it's hard to keep up. And then our children, of course, went to school in French. Their friends were French, and so then their English suffered a great deal. And I would try to then surround them with English-speaking people or have English-speaking friends here. I have always spoken English with them, but they speak French with each other and French with their father. So it makes, everyday life a little confusing at times. But
well, how did you learn French?
Well, I learned French in school. I could read it and write it a bit when I was married, but of course I couldn't speak it or understand conversational French. And well, I just sort of learned by osmosis, I suppose. And then I would read a lot in French. And I found that reading plays in French helped me for dialogue. Because it's one thing reading prose, but it's not the way people speak. So I tried to read plays as much as possible.
I'd like to turn to you now and talk about you. What do you see as your future at this point? You're still a very young woman. You've got a fascinating past. Do you have any plans for the future? Are you thinking of doing things?
Oh, well, I've always got lots of plans and projects, and that's the trouble. I get involved in too many things, and there's never enough time for them all. But no, well, my youngest child now has just graduated from high school, and so this is another kind of turning point in our lives. I'm very involved in, as you know, many of the charitable and cultural aspects of the Principality and many projects here. I also have been involved in things outside of the Principality, such as the Irish-American Cultural Institute, the La Leche League that promotes breastfeeding women. And I've been giving some poetry readings in the last few years, and I have plans to continue that.
What got you back into poetry reading? Because that's one of the more interesting activities you do now.
I was asked to participate in a program of American poetry for the in 1976 for the bicentennial, and there was a program that was going to be done. First of all, it was supposed to be done. Was initiated through the cultural attaché at the embassy in London, and then we gave the program at the Edinburgh Festival. And then after that, I was asked to join in others at Stratford and mainly in England. And then we'd done 2 tours in the United States at several of the universities. And so it's been very enjoyable. It doesn't take too much time, and it's something that I like doing very much.
Some people seem to feel that your poetry readings are kind of an advanced step to maybe going back to acting or going to the movies. Is that right?
I don't know. There's been a lot of, you know, I'm very flattered that people think that I could still be in pictures. This is, you know, 26 years later. It's a long time. And, but, you know, acting is a very time-consuming profession. And to do it well, one has to do it completely. And it's a full-time job.
But with your children now pretty much growing up and about to leave the nest, you would have more time if you really did want to try that again.
I suppose it would mean a complete reorganization of my life, and it would be a very difficult decision to make.
Well, you're not saying that if somebody came along with that offer that you couldn't refuse, that you wouldn't say yes.
I have always tried to avoid saying never or always in my life.
In a way, you've had 2 separate lives. I mean, you had your life as an actress, and now you've had your life here in Monaco. To what extent did your first life affect your second life?
Well, I think, well, certainly my training as an actress has helped me enormously in what I've had to do here. One's whole education is called upon constantly, you know, as one goes through life. There's so many things that I'm grateful that I have studied, even though I never thought that it would ever come in handy, or certainly training for the theater and the discipline, I suppose, that one learns in the theater and in pictures has been extremely helpful to me.
But you maintain your interest in the theater through all this period of time.
Oh, certainly, certainly. I'm interested in all creative activity, you know.
And what about your links with people with whom you went through your career? I mean, have you maintained your links with people that directed you in pictures or acted in pictures with you?
Yes, definitely.
Any
with many.
Particular relationships that have survived these years?
Oh, yes. Well, there are quite a few friends from Hollywood. There are many who live here in Europe now that I see, and others that come and visit. Yes.
As you've watched the evolution of the world, and you have not only watched it, but you've traveled a lot in it over the last 25 years, do you have any thoughts on the evolution of social mores or standards of life over the last 25 years?
Yes, of course, we've seen so much change, haven't we? I regret seeing the breakdown of the family in many countries, and I think this is one of the big tragedies of our age, because it is the nucleus of society. Also, perhaps that things are more liberal, more open, freer today. In a way, one good side of it that I see is that people are able to discuss more openly things that used to be hidden with great pains in the past. And I think, well, growing up has never been easy, has it? But I think perhaps it's easier today because perhaps parents can speak more freely with their children on certain subjects which they never dared speak about before. And after all, bringing up our children, we want to help them as much as we can and try to guide them. And of course, my children think that I grew up in the Stone Age, as you know, all parents did. But still, we have been able to have a conversation, a dialogue, and a contact, and discuss most of the problems and most of the things that affect society today.
One of the major things that's happened in the last 25 years has been the feminist movement. Has that touched you in any way or interested you in any way?
Certainly it has. It hasn't touched me very much because I always felt when I went away to school and started working, I felt very free and liberated already. I was earning my own living before I was 19. I didn't feel, you know, I didn't feel as though I was suffering. Perhaps as a teenager, when I was growing up, I thought, well, you know, it would have been nicer to have been a boy than a girl, but I got over that very quickly. I've seen a lot of nice things come out of the liberation movement. I've seen a lot of unhappiness, too. Very often, I think the price for independence and freedom is often solitude and loneliness. Since the women's liberation has been in effect, the percentage of alcoholism amongst women has gone up enormously. This is not a very good sign, is it? I do think women should have the right to work and choose a profession, whatever they would like to do. And there are so many professions now open to women that they do extremely well. I myself was on a board of directors for 5 years, and I was the first woman to be on this board. And it was a very interesting experience, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
Did you feel like a token woman on this board?
Yes, I did, but that was all right.
I mean, do you see a difference between the European approach to feminism and the American approach? Is it more militant in America than it is here?
Well, probably it's talked about more in America, yes.
If you'd stayed in America, would you have been a supporter of the ERA? Would that have been a cause that would have interested you?
Well, I don't think, I think the results are interesting. I don't think I would have used those means, perhaps.
Have you reflected much on the political developments in America? Have you had any thoughts on what has happened to your country in the 25 years you've lived abroad?
Oh, yes, I follow it with much interest, and I can't say that I feel
Are you distressed?
equipped or informed enough to make any great statements about it, but I certainly have followed all of the problems and the anguish through the years with tremendous sentiment and feeling, certainly.
I mean, sitting here in Europe, I mean, do you think America is as much respected as it was 25 years ago, or is it equally as well respected?
I think it did lose a respect there for a number of years, which it is gaining back again.
What was your vision of why it lost that respect?
Well, I think rather weak leadership. When America was out in front and the strongest nation in the world, they didn't hold the reins as they should have, I don't think.
And you believe that there's now a comeback, though?
Well, I think so. I think, you know, as we know, very often after the war, Americans wanted to be liked, wanted to please. Well, it's very hard to be a leader and in that position and please everyone. You just can't.
You know, we talked at the beginning about you having lived as an American in Europe for 25 years. How does an American maintain his roots? Don't you have a feeling that we get cut off from our countries?
I would like to see boundaries and frontiers less important. I feel at home in many places, and I think it's the reason for that is about caring about people, and people are basically the same everywhere. They are different because of their habits, their traditions, the languages, the food they eat, but the basic needs and wants of people are the same. I don't think I respect nations and people's feelings for their love of their country. That's very important. But I do feel that today we must emphasize opening up borders and reaching out and not worrying who is, you know, how many medals did this country get in the games, how many did that one get. That is of little importance. I think in something like the Olympic Games or international sports, it is the individual that counts, or the team that counts. And I would like to see more of an emphasis on that.
You're talking now like a transnational. Do you consider yourself a transnational? Or
yes.
a transcultural?
Well, wherever I've gone in my travels, I've hated to be taken for a tourist. I'm delighted if I'm in a strange city and people come up and ask me directions, that they think that I might belong there, and I like that.
No, you're hitting a subject which fascinates me, because I really believe that a lot of what you say is right, that we ought to try to bring our young people up to be more transcultural and more transnational. And
well, I think a lot of that is different. Certainly with American youth today, they're traveling so much more. I mean, I never had the opportunities to travel when I was 18 as kids today have. I think this is wonderful.
But when you talked about continuity and roots, when we were talking some time ago about royalty, isn't also the attachment to a home country a part of continuity and roots as well?
Well, it is, and I don't see why one can't go without the other. The strength of America is the melting pot, perhaps, let's say, and all young first-generation Americans didn't want to be associated with their European countries. They wanted to be first American, didn't they? And this was the strength of America.
Earlier we were talking about, and you had something, sometimes a little harsh things to say about the press. And I must say, the kind of press you were talking about, I agree with you. I wonder if we can look at the entire press based on this kind of small segment of the press that goes in the direction of sensation.
It certainly must be a problem for you and for other serious journalists to, you know, have to deal with those who are less serious and less conscientious. You know, I've had feelings of resentment because we have a press office. I'm not that closed off in an ivory tower. People can pick up the phone and get a secretary or even get me on the phone. I've often asked editors, why don't you check? Call me. I'll be happy to tell you if it's true or not true. I don't mind if what people want to say. I mean, everyone's entitled to his own opinion. If a writer or editor want to say, well, I think Prince and Princess of Monaco are terrible, we don't like Monaco, that's one thing. But to put words in our mouths that are not true, or to quote us on things that we have never said, then I resent that. And unfortunately, there's very little one can do about it.
One of the ironies, it seems to me, is that the United States is the country where, for example, political leaders' private lives are the more scrutinized than they are in Europe. And
oh, absolutely. And I think this is a great problem for the United States. Certainly, if my husband was going into political life in the United States, I would feel like many wives do and say, don't do it. Who needs it? Who wants to be scrutinized to that extent? To give up all sense of privacy, all sense of home life, family life. For the children, what a burden that is. My father was in politics for 10 years when I was growing up, and I ended up by hating politics. Our phones were tapped. We were followed. You know, this was very disagreeable.
You put your finger on one of the great dilemmas of democracy, and that is how much are the people entitled to know about the backgrounds of the people that they're called upon to vote for, and what are they not entitled to know about them?
Well, how does one separate that? There's always the right to know, yes, the news that's fit to print, but then there's the morbid curiosity, and a lot of the press want to be the first with a scoop, with a bit of news, so they anticipate an event to the point sometimes where they will anticipate it to, instead of just anticipate, they make it up. And then, you know, they don't want to be left with egg on their face. I understand that. They want to be right there with the news before it happens. But as a result of this kind of freedom of the press, there's no freedom from it for the victims. There's no way we can get back. And there's no way that we can say that isn't true.
Thomas Jefferson once said that if he had to have a country without the press, or a country in which the press was controlled, or a country without the press, that he would prefer a country without the press.
Well, I think the press is important. A point of view is important. I think the more newspapers there are, the better, because it represents different points of view. It gives the public a chance to read many sides of a story and to make a decision. I'm certainly not for censorship. I'm against that, but I do believe that individuals must take a certain moral responsibility. It's up to the editors to take a moral responsibility. They make up captions for pictures. Of course, I'm talking about a certain type of press that invades our lives.
Sure.
I'm not talking about the political press or the international press. But pictures will be taken, and an editor sitting in his little ivory tower somewhere will write the captions that he thinks might be amusing or fitting or might sell. You know.
How do you explain the fact that more people want to read the National Enquirer than want to read the New York Times?
Well,
I mean, that's really, I mean, that's the bottom line of what we're talking about.
Well, this is unfortunate. But, and I know myself, years ago, I was asked to speak at the anniversary of the YWCA. It was held in Philadelphia. Celebrated the 100 years of the YWCA in America. And we were 4 women invited to speak on woman's role in contemporary society. One was Margaret Mead, the other Pauline Fredericks, Mrs. Martin Luther King, and myself. There were very few papers who carried anything about this. The New York Times never mentioned this. Yet the New York Times was very eager to write about my birthday party that was happening the next week, and what I was going to wear, and who was going to be there, and the frivolous, silly
So even the New York Times has succumbed to this.
Very frivolous at times, I'm afraid.
Do you bring it on yourselves at all? I mean,
well,
I'm not talking about politicians, because I mean they know what they're getting into when they run for public office, but in certain people, isn't it a price you have to pay for celebrity?
I suppose it is, and I'm willing to pay it up to a certain extent. I don't like being misquoted. I don't like being told, oh, Grace feels this way about this, or she resents that, or they don't know how I feel about it. How dare they assume my feelings? That I don't like.
I know it's much too early in your life to ask you this question, but at some point somebody's going to ask it to you. How are you going to want to be remembered?
Well, I suppose I think mostly in terms of my children and their children, how they will remember me. I would like to be remembered as trying to do my job well, of being understanding and kind.
Are there any things about your career that you'd like to have remembered? They will be remembered anyway.
Well, I don't know. I don't feel as though I achieved enough in my career to stand out more than many other people. I was very lucky in my career, and I loved it. And but I don't think I was accomplished enough as an actor to be remembered for that particularly. No, I'd like to be remembered as a decent human being and a caring one.
If you had another life, what would you like to do with that life? You ever thought of that?
Oh, well, there are lots of things. I've been asked that. I think now if I have to be reincarnated, I think I'd like to come back as one of my dogs. They have a very happy, nice life and a very easy one.